Greg, did you have testimony? Greg Vassal from Greb?
I was going to offer a couple of remarks, and then I have got Adam Hunley from Goulston, who's one of our members who wanted to speak. He practices in this area.
Okay, I just want to make sure I added you to the list. So Adam
Hunley.
Hunley from Goulston, and Greg Vassal from Greb. All right, cool. Thank you very much. We'll go ahead and get rolling. I know Councilor Bach is on her way. And I think
Madam Chair, I'm here.
Yeah, all right, then we're good to go. Good morning, everyone. I'm Lydia Edwards, Chair of Government Operations. It's Thursday, February 18th, 2021. And we're here today for a virtual working session on docket 0296, petition for a special law regarding an act relative to the Boston Landmarks Commission. This matter was sponsored by Councilor Bach and Councilor Braden and was referred to the committee on February 3rd, 2021. The committee held a hearing on February 8th, 2021. In accordance with Governor Baker's executive order modifying open meeting laws, we are able to conduct our business on Zoom. This allows us to continue our job of making sure that laws and ordinances and conversations happen, at the same time balancing the public need and safety of the moment. Public may watch this hearing live via live stream, at www.boston.gov/city-council-tv on Xfinity 8, RCN 82, Verizon 964. It will also be rebroadcasted at a later date. For public testimony, written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.go@boston.gov and will be made a part of the record and available to all the councilors. Quick summary of what is before us. This is a home rule petition, which will amend Section 2 of Chapter 772 of the Acts of 1975, as most recently amended by Section 11 of Chapter 373 of the Acts of 2018, by changing the definition of the term landmark. The change will allow for local resources that have historical significance in the community to be designated as landmarks. At the hearing, the committee discussed the current process for landmarking, the importance of local involvement, as well as the relationship between historic preservation and development. We were very clear that we believe the two can coexist and that you can develop and also acknowledge the history and significance of certain landmarks in a community. The committee also discussed resources with the significance to the city's neighborhoods and how they would be designated as landmarks. The committee recognized that having landmarks with local significance will provide equity and will allow the city of Boston to preserve its local history. Participating today, along with the councilors who are here, is Roseanne Foley, Executive Director of the Landmark Commission, Lynn Smillage, Chair of the Landmarks, Greg Gaylor, Executive Director of Boston Preservation Alliance, Paul Steinke. I apologize if I mispronounced.
No, you got it exactly right. I give you great props. Thank you.
Executive Director of the Preservation Alliance of Greater Philadelphia. We also have Greg Vassal from Greater Boston Real Estate Board and Adam Hunley, from Goulston Stores. So what we'll do is we'll have the councilors do some, actually, I'm just going to have I'll announce who's here and have the lead sponsor do a brief intro if she feels one is necessary. And then we're going to get down to the working session or the business of the working session. So in order of arrival, we have Councilor Flaherty, Councilor Flynn, and the lead sponsors, Councilor Bach, and myself here today. I'm just checking real quick to make sure any of my colleagues may have joined. I don't believe so. Oh, Councilor Baker is also here. I did not skip you, Councilor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. It's an internal joke. So with that, Councilor Bach, a very brief comment so we can get to work.
Sure. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And thanks to everyone for being here today. Councilor Braden and I introduced this as a very simple change to the landmarks legislation. In fact, it's so simple that I've now had a couple of media folks call me and say, it doesn't seem like you're changing anything at all, because we're just switching an and to a comma and an or. And frankly, I think there's some argument that it may have been intended from the start when the Landmarks Commission's legislation came in 1975 to make it possible to landmark things that are of significance to the city. But the way the language is worded has led to a situation in Boston where our Landmarks Commission is only able Sorry, I think I'm getting feedback from someone's machine.
I'll go on mute. They might-
But a situation in Boston where in order to landmark something, it has to be of significance to the state or the nation. And as we've learned through digging into this, that's contrary to what a huge number of other cities are able to do around the country. We're very pleased to be joined here today by a representative from Philadelphia, as was mentioned, but we have dug up dozens of examples of places where folks are able to do local landmarks in all our kind of peer cities, and even across the river in Cambridge, they're able to do that. And I think that as the city approaches its 400th anniversary at the end of this decade, it's really important that we be able to preserve history that's important to all the city's communities. And the tendency with the state and national significance standard has been to skew towards kind of white, wealthy historical narratives at the expense of many of our immigrant neighborhoods and preserving Black history in the city. And so I think it's a simple change, but it will open up the process, which is still a process for landmarking, to all of this really worthy, important history. And so I think it is a small but significant blow that we could strike for equity in historical preservation and commemoration. And I was also grateful to the administration for coming to our hearing and expressing support for this change, and also for the examples they provided of the fact that right now we've ended up with a kind of workaround where often we're creating one building architectural conservation districts in order to save things that are really important to the city. And I think it would be more straightforward and more consistent with what we're doing elsewhere to make this small change. So it's a home rule petition, would then go to the State House, and I hope to earn colleague support. And thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this working session today.
Thank you. So we're going to go right to work, unless in terms of the language and suggestions and questions that folks may have. And I listed some folks already who were here during the hearing, and I just want to go ahead and go back to them. Unless any of the counselors want to have language changes right now, I'm going to go ahead and go right to the invited guests. And I'm seeing no hands being raised. Okay. So we'll start with the Landmarks Commission. We'll start with the chair, the Landmarks Commission, Roseanne Foley, Executive Director, excuse me. You're not here. All right, Lynn.
Well, I think she might be on mute.
Oh. I don't see everybody on screen at the same time. Roseanne?
Hello, Madam Chair. I just had some internet issues, and of course, the timing was exquisite. I am so grateful that this is coming up. We've had many potential landmarks that were of significance at the local level that we just we disappointed a lot of folks in the neighborhoods because we just were not able to make the case for above local significance. And it takes us a lot of time as staff to go through each one of these proposals. And it's a change that is long overdue. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Lynn?
Thank you. I want to say hello to Adam.
Hey, Lynn.
Hi, who served on the Landmarks Commission, and we miss him. Just a couple sort of disparate comments. First of all, I think this is a no-brainer, and I'm excited about it. I know some questions have been raised about concern about whether or not there would be a sudden flood of petitions. I don't see that happening because I think probably the vast majority of Bostonians already think that a building that's significant in Boston is eligible. So I wouldn't anticipate that. Also, some questions raised about the ability to develop these properties. And I just have a short list of properties that are either landmarks or pending landmarks that have been developed. A whole lot of them for housing. The Collins Mansion in South Boston, the Hayden Building at Downtown Crossing, the Charlestown Savings Bank is undergoing development and incorporating housing. St. Gabriel's Monastery, the Chestnut Hill Pumping Station, the Ames Building, the Rope Walk at the Navy Yard, another pending landmark undergoing rehabilitation for housing. Blessed Sacrament Church, the Albert Kittredge House, the St. James African Orthodox Church in Roxbury. So there are a lot of examples. I also think as far as how this will affect the operation of the Landmarks Commission, it wouldn't be really appreciable. I think the commissioners would need to kind of solidify some more concrete criteria for establishing local significance, since that's not what we've been used to doing. But I feel it's very doable and I'm very optimistic about it. So thanks.
Thank you. So we'll just go on with our invited guests. I think I had, was it Greg next? Greg Gaylor, yep, Executive Director of the Boston Preservation Alliance.
Thank you, and thanks, councilors, for recognizing the importance of this issue, as well as the robust discussion at the hearing. I think the questions at the hearing were spot on, and recognizing the value of historic resources to the success of the city and its residents, and the important role that the Landmarks Commission plays. And the fact that BLC needs more support, that this change is an important first step if we want all our residents to be able to be empowered by the history of the city. Everyone should really have the opportunity to be inspired by the places they walk by or visit that played a central role in the creation of the city that we have today, and should be able to really find some connection, some personal connection to themselves, and to see someone who looks like them in the historic places we protect. So we heard, as Councilor Block mentioned, from our peers throughout the country that local designation based on local significance is the norm. So Boston's really the outlier, which really makes no sense for a city that prides itself so much in its history. We're really behind the times, and this is a small change that will really help solve the problem. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions, and I had a list in front of me as well of historic resources that have been landmarked, that have been redeveloped. It happens all the time. The list could go on and on. We could list more places if people want to get into that, and also review other cities. But we did request our friend from Philadelphia to comment, because they've been struggling and working to improve their rules and regulations as well. So I think he may have some useful insight for us. Thanks.
Madam Chair, you're muted.
I sounded wonderful, by the way, when I was talking. No one could hear it. I said that's a wonderful introduction for Paul Sankey, the Executive Director for the Preservation Alliance of Philadelphia, or Greater Philadelphia. Paul?
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you this morning from a much younger city. We're only about 330 years old. And Boston is certainly one of my favorite cities in the country. Greg asked me to join to just vouch for the fact that the change that you all are considering making for the city of Boston would reflect exactly the criteria that we have in place here in Philadelphia. Our preservation ordinance, the one that's on the books today, was passed in 1985. There's been some amendments, but the criteria for designation do allow a building, complex of buildings, structure, site, object, or district to be designated for preservation if, and there are 9 criteria, I won't read them all, but the first 2 are the most important for this conversation. So if it has significant character, interest, or value as part of the development, heritage, or cultural characteristics of the city, commonwealth, or nation, that word or is associated with the life of a person significant in the past. And by the way, as most of you probably know, Pennsylvania also calls itself a commonwealth. Then number 2 under this list, if it's associated with an event of importance to the history of the city, commonwealth, or nation. So we're already in that place where local significance is considered adequate for local designation as a historic landmark. And I would also point out that the National Register of Historic Places also recognizes local significance as sufficient, if it can be demonstrated, to place a property on the National Register of Historic Places. So Boston would also be getting in line with the way the federal government does this as well. So I think that's the main point that Greg asked me to make, but I'll stay on as long as you'd like me to, if you have any questions.
Thank you very much. We'll just go now to Greg Bethel from the Greater Boston Real Estate Board.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On behalf of the Greater Boston Real Estate Board, we would like to thank the Government Operations Committee for scheduling this working session. It was really important for us when we learned of this proposal to take a few moments and talk to our membership and try to get a sense on what this would mean and how this would affect them. We absolutely understand the spirit with which this is offered in, and many of our members have done projects, and Greg Gaylor has actually honored them at different events and are key members of his organization. So we understand the spirit in which it was offered and believe in historic preservation. One of the things that we have come up with is the fact that there could be potential unintended consequences as a result of this change. And we wanted to bring those to the attention of the committee in the form of this working session. So with me, I'm really happy to have Adam Hundley, who's a member of ours. Adam is an attorney at Goulston and Storrs. He's a partner, and he practices in this area. So Madam Chair, if you don't mind, I'd love to turn this over to Adam so he can talk a little bit about the change and the concept of sort of a transitioning aspect of this, and or as it's used to be called, sort of a grandfathering aspect for projects that have already been through this.
Absolutely.
Great. Thanks, Greg. So good morning, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to talk. This is the first time I've spoken at a council working session. I'm genuinely honored to do so. As Greg mentioned, I'm a partner at Goulston and Storrs in the real estate department. I guess I'm speaking largely for the development and real estate community, but I've spent much of my career working with and in the preservation community. In fact, as Lynn said, I had the distinction of working with her and Roseanne, at least for a brief period of time, on the Landmarks Commission. I've seen Greg's name dozens or hundreds of times over the years, so I'm thrilled to be working with this group. So I also love the spirit of this legislation. How could I not? And if the council and this group are willing to consider the issue that Greg and I have spotted, any language that we propose would not delete or change a single word of the existing draft legislation. All we have in mind is potentially adding a little bit of language to clarify the intent in the application of the language. And that's what I wanted to mention here. So as Greg mentioned, the simple concept is transition. And I think most people are familiar with the concept as grandfathering. I think we're just trying to get away from using that word now. So we started using the concept of transition language. And the basic idea is just one of fairness, predictability, precedent setting for projects that are already in the pipeline. So the idea is if a project has done everything right and has analyzed and is in compliance with all laws and proceeded partway through the permitting process, it would seem unfair to effectively change the rules on that project halfway through the process. In fact, if that became a pattern, it would really chill the real estate and the development community, because people, including lenders and investors and buyers, would start worrying that projects are doing okay and they're partway through a permitting process, but things could change on them all of a sudden. And suddenly there are new risks and new costs and new time delays. So in a lot of new laws, there is so-called transition language, again, formerly known as grandfathering language, which basically says if you've gone through a process, you don't have to go through it again based on a change to the underlying law. And also, if you're partway through a process, if you've spent time and money and energy to get, say, halfway through a permitting process, you're allowed to continue your project under those laws, under those permitting practices as they existed when you started, and you wouldn't be subject to any new laws. I see this a lot. In fact, a couple of days ago, this probably just demonstrates I should find better uses of my time, but I flipped through the Boston zoning code and I found literally 47 different articles that have some level of transition language in them. So the Zoning Commission and the BPDA and the mayor have been really good about putting this kind of language in the zoning code as new articles come along. And I think this concept applies to this home rule petition, the legislation as well. I'll just spin out a couple of quick examples. So let's say a project has gone a year or 2 or 3, that can certainly happen, into a permitting and a design review process. And it's at the point where it has zoning variances. It hasn't started construction, but it's gotten very far into the permitting process. And as part of that planning and design work and permitting, it has analyzed the BLC enabling legislation and the likelihood of somebody submitting a landmarks petition. And it's decided that the risk is low enough that it's comfortable proceeding. So if this law is passed, could that mean that somebody could file a petition to landmark this building, even though it's gone through all this effort and time and expense to get where it is? Another example is maybe even more on point. Let's say there's a building that's been the subject of a landmarking petition already, and the BLC has denied it or rejected it. Let's say that building has also gone through demolition delay. I would totally agree that demolition delay in Boston doesn't have teeth. But if somebody goes through the process and they are entitled to a demolition permit, again, it would seem unfair if the rule changed on that project towards the end of the process. So what Greg and I have thought about is whether there might be an opportunity to add a little bit of language to the legislation that would account for this issue. In other words, add a little bit of transition language to the legislation. If the council were willing, we've jotted down a few ideas that I'd be happy to send to Christine or others so people could see them. I will say, I'll be the first to admit, legislative drafting is hard. I love the simplicity of this legislation. And as I was putting pen to paper, I was trying to come up with transition language that was just a sentence or 2 at most. I think I came up with a sentence or 2 that works. The language certainly could be more robust. There could be more legalese, but again, I was trying to honor the spirit of this legislation, which is short, simple, efficient, and come up with a couple of concepts. The concepts were basically along the lines of what I said, that if a project has been reviewed by the Landmarks Commission, either through Article 85 demo delay or through an actual landmarking petition and gotten through that process, it wouldn't be subject to the specific changes being proposed to the legislation. And another concept, if the council were willing to consider it, is a broader concept that if a project has received approvals from the Board of Appeal or the Boston Redevelopment Authority or the Inspectional Services Department, those actions couldn't in effect be thwarted or overcome by application of this proposed change to the legislation. So again, it would only be a little bit of additional language, wouldn't touch the existing legislation, which I have to, respect and support being in the preservation community. It would just hopefully provide some guidance to everybody, and in particular the real estate and development community, about how this legislation, if it's passed, would be applied to existing projects.
Do you have that language now?
I do.
Could you email it to ccc.go@boston.gov? I only ask because that's usually what was likely going to happen is I was going to bring this before my colleagues next week.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd rather have the discussion about that language here now.
Okay.
Right. And then if we can come to a compromise here now, then no one's going to be wondering about what's being brought before the body next week.
Okay.
So if what you're saying is that 1 or 2 sentences, I think that's, we could digest that together as a group.
Okay.
So if you can email that, I'll give you a couple minutes to email that. And in the meantime, I'm going to go over to my colleagues to see if they have any questions. And then when that email is in, Christine will forward it to all my colleagues. And I think actually she might even be able to do it to everybody who's here.
Okay.
So we can all look at it together.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Counselor. It's a great idea. Can I just confirm the email address? I know I have Christine's because she emailed me this web.
Oh, that's fine then. Just
link.
use Christine's.
Yeah.
Just use
Okay.
Christine's,
If
correct.
you give me just a minute, thanks.
Wonderful. So going in order of arrival of my colleagues, I don't know if the lead sponsor would like to kick it off with some brief comments or questions. what's on the table right now is a suggested language that kind of makes sure that that there is no retroactive application of some project that has gone through the vetting as it is now and has passed that vetting. The other proposed suggestion, if I understand, is a broader kind of vetting from the ZBA ISD, that vetting can't be undone by what is being proposed now. So Councillor Bach, and then Councillor Flaherty, then Councillor Flynn, then Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of comments. I'll hold comments obviously on the language until we see it. Just one thing while we're also breaking, I just wanted to let colleagues know that you have in your inbox, and thank you to the Preservation Alliance for this. In addition to the Philadelphia example, we pulled together other places that do local landmarking, and so have a kind of document that rounds up, I think, besides Cambridge and Philly, we've got DC, Milwaukee, Baltimore, Fort Worth, Denver, LA, New Orleans, Cleveland, Chicago, Houston, Dallas. And those are just some of the folks who circle back to us with examples of what they do. So just again, that's, I think, in everybody's inbox, courtesy of Christine. So just wanted to make sure that people get a chance to see that. And then in terms of the suggestion from the real estate board and from Adam, I mean, I definitely think that coming up with something that sort of helps establish those legitimate expectations for people who are already in a process makes sense to me. I think that, I mean, it needs to be sufficiently narrowly drawn. For instance, like, you know, if some of these old buildings we hope are going to stick around for a while, if somebody initiated a landmarks petition now and 50 years from now, something comes out, you know, I think there's some edge cases, right, of trying to think about what counts as being in a process and what, you know, and not sort of not making it the additional sentences hugely onerous. And as you referred to, Adam, you know, we have a fear here in the council that the longer something is that we send up to the State House, the less likely it is to make its way through. So certainly we want kind of drafting efficiency, but definitely open to looking at that language and having that conversation. I think what's really, I think I just want to underscore to Lynn's point as well. I think that Bostonians don't make this distinction when they bring things to the Landmarks Commission right now. I think they bring something to the Landmarks Commission because it feels like an essential part of their built environment and their storied history. And so I think part of what I'm trying to do is make the actual law and the remit of the Landmarks Commission more closely match that aspiration amongst our residents from all our communities. So I guess I would be curious to sort of hear what Lynn and Roseanne and Greg's instincts are on this piece as well, Madam Chair, when that's appropriate.
Great. Councillor Flaherty.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for hosting, and also for the lead sponsors, Councillor Bach and Braden, for their efforts here, and for the panelists. And obviously the goal for me here is to make sure that we continue the productive discussion that we had during the hearing, particularly as it pertains to how critical it is for our city to have the ability to proactively protect the many historical buildings that we have in our city and in our community. So particularly so that residents and developers have transparency and predictability in process, and kind of goes to the sort of the theory and in practice breakdown. And obviously Adam made some very valid points in terms of sort of how it actually plays out. So be interested to sort of see when those are reduced to writing. Seem to make sense from my vantage point. And again, looking forward to, I think, from this hearing, also working with landmarks to make sure that they're appropriately funded and given the resources so that they can be more proactive as opposed to reactive. And I mentioned in the initial hearing that oftentimes in the community process, folks will reach out at the 11th hour to landmarks to engage them, and some of it, all of it legit for historical purposes, and others trying to block a project. So want to make sure that it's used as the very proactive, useful tool, and that it's appropriate and it's not being used at the 11th hour to try to thwart one's efforts to develop or redevelop in the city. And so striking that balance, I think, is important. And again, while I'm looking forward to Adam's language to see whether or not that is something that would fit well here. And my last point is to Greg Galler. Are you on the corner of G and Silver Street? Because if you are, it looks like my aunt's house is on your left with the flagpole coming out of it. So great view there.
I'll tell her you said hello.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you.
Counselor Flynn? Counselor Flynn may have give him. Okay, one second. Counselor Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd just like to.
I apologize, Counselor Baker. We have been joined by Counselor Salvi George before you go. Counselor Baker.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to echo some of what Council Flaherty had to say, that you hate to see this good legislation used as a weapon to try and, block developments. But I'm also interested in the changes that that Greg had put forward. Greg and I don't know what the name, I forget what you. Adam and Greg before. I just got them. I think that they're valuable in adding them in on this ordinance, on this home rule petition here, just to make, because I have something in that exact position right now. They've been going through there in the community now for probably a year and a half or two, and I think people may finally be in an okay position. I'd hate to see something like this that we pass, block that when it's at the 11th hour. So, and also thank the lead sponsor and also the people that are on the Landmarks Commission for the work that you do. Thank you for what you do. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Counselor Salvi George.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this conversation this afternoon. I am tuning in late, so I don't want to repeat what anyone else has said. So I'm here just to listen and engage. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So I'm up next in terms of comments. So I'm looking at the language now. I think everyone has, can we just confirm everyone got it? Everyone has it? Lynn, Greg, Gaylor, okay. All right. And so it seems the bold language is what's added to the current language that we, right, okay. And so it's two sections as Adam described. The first one really discusses applications that have already been, I guess, vetted by the Landmarks Commission before this law is passed, and that would not, this wouldn't undo that. Then the second part is more broad and seems to say that, or says essentially that the Landmarks Commission, no action for the Landmarks Commission under Section 1, which is not here because we're amending Section 2, but under Section 1 shall be inconsistent with or invalidate any actions taken prior to the effective date of this act by the Zoning Board of Appeal, Boston Redevelopment Authority, or Inspectional Services Department of the City of Boston. I can tell you my knee-jerk reaction is that second part is way too broad. It's way too broad. If you want to talk about abuse of people blocking development, I feel like people would use that language to say that you can't, we've gone through ISD, we've gone through the BRA, we've gone through these things. So Landmarks Commission, you have no voice to be had at this point. And I'm not comfortable with that language at all. The first part where we want to make sure that there's a consistent understanding and application as in we're moving forward. We're not going to be looking backwards. If the Landmarks Commission has spoken, they've spoken. But I cannot imagine that I would ever be comfortable with basically saying the Landmark Commission is just forever under, like, will never have any impact on ISD, BRA, or ZBA. Especially right now with the controversies around the all three agencies, but especially the ZBA and the BPDA. Many people believe that the Landmarks Commission is one of the few places where they can go and actually be heard. So those are my thoughts about that. And so I'm going to go actually over to Lynn and Greg and Roseanne about your thoughts about any of the language that's proposed. So we can start with, actually, Roseanne, I think was the first on to go. So is Roseanne Foley? You still?
Hello, Madam Chair. Yeah, I'm having problems with my computer, so I just locked my video to see if that helps. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay, so the part where we're talking about if a landmark petition has already been heard and not accepted and denied by the commission, that's actually handled further down in the enabling legislation. There's a 2-year waiting period for another petition to be heard by the commission. So that's already handled.
Do you have the section for that? Or is it, we can look it up, but
Yeah, I don't off the top of my head. I should at this point because I've read it so many times. The other, it would be, I'm trying to be polite about this, but other city agencies don't trump the Landmarks Commission's work. We have this problem all the time with the zoning ordinance, the zoning code, Article 85, where it is required before there is a demolition permit for us to check to see if a building is historic. Once a building goes through Article 85, that's it. There's no coming back and going through Article 85 again. That has nothing to do with the enabling legislation, has nothing to do with landmarking. It's zoning. So that is kind of not really connected to landmarking at all. Same with ISD, same with BPDA. It's the Article 80 process is not linked at all to the landmarking process. Our work is separate, and people are, constantly confused and frustrated that they've gone through all these processes and then they're told they have to come to us for Article 85, and then the neighbors put a petition together. This is very common, but it just seems like this is not the place to link up all the different agencies as part of a simple, adding a comma to our enabling legislation to allow for a simpler way to landmark locally significant resources. And the last thing is that we can already landmark locally significant resources through the Architectural Conservation District process. So there's, on the surface, I get it. Grandfathering or transitional language is a nice idea, but this language doesn't actually, it doesn't get to the transition that might be needed for this small change. Thanks.
thank you. Lynn?
Thank you. Yes, I agree strongly that Article 85 definitely should play no part in this. It's really confusing the issues. They're not related. I think there's also a hope that at some point Article 85 is going to be completely revamped or replaced with something more effective. So I would sort of hate to introduce it into legislative language when it might change dramatically. I would just stop after in the first sentence on a landmarking petition, period. And that certainly seems reasonable, but definitely very uncomfortable with the rest of it. And I think it really confuses and conflates the issues.
Thank you. So we have one suggestion for, so we have Adam's suggested language, of which Lynn just said her suggestion is to get to the balance of making sure projects are not put in a gray area, to simply put after the word petition a period and to delete the rest of it. So it would read, however, section 1 shall not apply to any property which, prior to the effective date of this act, was the subject of action by the Landmarks Commission on a landmarking petition, period. Okay. Then we have Greg Gaylor.
Hi, thank you, Counselor. While I understand the intent and question and requests, we certainly don't want to penalize people that are already made their certain way through a process. And predictability, we certainly support and think that this whole effort is enhancing predictability. The comment was made about unintended consequences of the initial proposal, and this is to resolve that. I think this actually generates more unintended consequences on top. And even, that abbreviated version and the suggestion by Lynn, I think is problematic. Because, part of our whole discussion was our concept of what is historic and significant is not fixed in time. It evolves and changes, and properties we consider significant today and people's history we consider significant today, we may not have 20, 30, 40 years ago, and again going forward. So while I understand the desire for property is, well along a current process, I think if we're going to do some sort of language like this, it really needs to be narrow and focused on things that are currently active, currently at a certain point in an approval process. Because otherwise, even that shortened language, that means you could never come back and revisit a property in 50 years, as Councillor Bach sort of alluded to earlier. And I think that's very problematic. As Roseanne noted, the language currently allows things to come back for landmark reconsideration after a 2-year waiting period. So that, keeps someone from keep coming back and back and back. So I think this really needs to be narrowed somehow to things that are at a certain approval process. And then you get into the challenge that people were just mentioning, which is, BPDA approval is different from landmarks approval. So I think this needs to be redefined much more carefully. And it's a little hard to do it on the fly.
Would just a point of clarification, since the law already has the 2-year wait period, would it make sense then, and this is to Adam, or to simply say prior to the effective date, or instead of prior to the effective date, that can encompass a lot of projects, say within the last 2 years, or within the 2 years of the effective date, so that we're only concerned with those, like they would have a wait period, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I hear you. So these are all good comments. Councillor Edwards, I'll respond to that in just a second. If I could just briefly mention, I never intended this language to have any city agency trump any other agency, just to emphasize or to prevent a project going back to the Landmarks Commission. Again, all I'm suggesting is that the current change arguably shouldn't apply to a project that's already gone through its permitting process. So if I bought a building under the current legislation, I would do a risk analysis and a project analysis and a planning analysis based on the legislation that currently exists. And it seems to me it would be fair for that legislation to govern whether I can change the building or demolish the building. Going forward, for any new project, the new legislation would apply. So,
but I think that's where we're a little bit confused. If I bought this project in 1970, and then didn't want to do anything until for a while, that the whole, I bought it under a certain set of regulations. But then the regulations changed on me. I guess I want to make sure that at least that's where I think some people are confused. We don't, the prior before this act is pretty broad.
Yeah, but totally understand that. But the language, why don't we focus on the first sentence? I think Lynn makes a fair point. Certainly it gets broader towards the end and even towards the end of the first sentence. But if we focus on the language that Lynn was focused on, it would only apply if there's been an actual action by the Landmarks Commission. Honestly, I don't love the idea of capping it at 2 years, because there are plenty of projects that are in permitting, especially this day and age, that have been in permitting for many years, but they might have the benefit of a landmarking petition that's been rejected or denied. And that's all this language would apply to. Only if a particular building has been the subject of a petition and Landmarks Commission has rejected it or dismissed it, it then couldn't be subject to a new petition based on the broader BLC jurisdiction under this legislation. I guess that means that if new state level significance were discovered in the future or evolved in the future, it could still be subject to a petition. But again, it will be under the existing regime. So
But
under the
not-
state level.
I think Roseanne Foley brought up the fact, and it's section 85-4, that there's a 2-year wait period anyway within
Yeah.
the law. So if it's rejected, what if I try to landmark my house and it's rejected, I would have to wait 2 years anyway. And then I would, so that they would proceed under the current standard as is. I don't understand how this is different.
Yeah, I'm with you, Counselor. Again, I guess I would just mention, especially in this day and age, I'm working on a lot of projects that are just dead in their tracks. They started 5 years ago, 4 years ago, 10 years ago, and they have permits and they've gotten whatever extensions they need, but they just haven't started construction yet. And I think those kinds of projects would be very concerned about the risk of a new petition under the new legislation. And I guess in my mind, if a petition were rejected 3 years ago or 4 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, it still seems like it's fairly gone through the process.
I understand. So if essentially my process is taking 8 years, and in that process, I got a favorable landmarking decision that dismissed an attempt to landmark my house, those petitioners could easily come back under the new regulations, and
Correct.
and then now subject me to a different set of standards.
Correct.
I don't know how that's different from other things that happen. I mean, we change our zoning all the time. We change what the standards are for a variance, and sometimes time is not your friend. If you have 10 years in the process and the laws change on you, we do it with civil rights. We do it with our environmental laws.
Right.
We've done it with the zoning amendment we passed. Folks, when they amend, they have to usually go to a higher standard.
Right.
So,
Council, I'm totally with you. Again, though, for what it's worth, honestly, I think there are 47 articles of the zoning code that have transition language like this, and it's usually more robust, and it basically says the new zoning is not applicable to projects that have filed for a building permit or have filed for zoning relief or have filed for a PDA prior to the publication of notice of the zoning amendment. And again, I think that's just a fairness argument that you can't subject projects that are in the pipeline to new zoning. And that's really all this is in a slightly different, more efficient form.
okay. I'm going to go back through, oh, sorry, Greg Vassal, did you have any? I didn't call on you, that's all. I didn't know if you.
No, that's fine. I'm fine. Thank
And
you.
Paul from Philadelphia,
Yes.
did you have any? I mean, we're on the language. It might be a little too in the weeds for you, but that's where I'm wondering if you have any comments on that. And I see you, Patricia Bomber as well. Did you want to comment at all? No? Okay. So just on the language, if you had any suggestions. I don't know if Philadelphia is in the middle of this as well. Maybe you have some.
Nothing exactly like this, but what occurs to me, and this may or may not be helpful, is that if a property is subject to an active permit application, that at the time that this legislation is passed, that there would be a carve out for that property. But if it's a defunct application, as one of the guests here today suggested, that goes back 5 or 10 years, I don't see why that property wouldn't be subject to the provisions of this amendment. So that's the one reaction I had to this conversation. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. It looks like we have actually some people from the public who may want to comment. So I'm going to check in with Carrie, just to my colleagues. I just got this text, so I apologize to the people who are waiting. I'm going to check the wait room and see Allison Poltinas.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for calling on me. Hope you can hear me all right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Allison, when you
just a couple thoughts, and
Before you go, Allison, could you give us a little context? Are you, with an organization? Are you?
Oh, sure. Active citizen preservationist, Friends of Historic Mission Hill, often following Landmarks Commission meetings, and have submitted petitions, some successful, some not, for buildings like the Gardner Museum, et cetera, in the area. Counselor, I don't believe you read aloud the 2 sentences that Attorney Hunley proposed, so that might be helpful, but.
Happy to do so. Happy to do so.
Oh, okay. Thank you. My 2 comments related to understanding the duration of a permitting process that projects in Boston go through. It can be very expansive, as mentioned earlier, and factors like COVID or recessions, et cetera, can cause projects to get extended, extensions and longer periods of time with where an applicant is allowed to continue with ISD and so on. And that gets very vague, I would say. It's a very open-ended, it's not a clear, well-defined area in Boston, I feel like. And so involving that with the submission of landmark petitions seems a very complicated thing. It seems like there's separate tracks. I think the process of submitting a petition to Landmarks Commission is something that then you can rely on the commission to either accept or reject a petition. And certainly if a petition has been accepted and it's put on the pending list, as there's a very long list of pending designated petitions for designation, those buildings that are on the pending list should be allowed to be considered under any change in language in the legislation. So I would be concerned if once a petition has been accepted years ago for a project for a building, that it's still going to be considered under the new language, just to be clear about that. So thank you for hearing my testimony.
No, I appreciate that. And I just for clarification purposes. So I think Adam was mentioning that there are a lot of projects that were not landmarked that may be then held to a higher standard that could make them landmarked. I think what Allison just brought up is there's some that were found to have been landmarked before. And as they're going through this process, I guess, Allison, I'm a little confused. Would you want them to be re-landmarked or?
No, I'm saying the pending, just to clear up, the idea is a petition is accepted, but it isn't, there's a second process with a hearing to actually vote on a designation. A study report has to be done and so on. So there's often a very long period of time between when a petition has been accepted and the actual vote on designation. And so all those buildings that are on the pending landmark list, some of those might only have what's called local significance right now. And when a vote is actually taken, if the vote had been taken right now, they wouldn't have received designation. But under the new legislation, potentially they might be. But they've been on the pending list for a long time, just to make sure that once the vote is, when their hearing is scheduled for a vote, that it's the new legislation that they would be subject to.
Councillor, can I respond briefly to that?
Absolutely. And then we're going to go through to councillors.
Thank you. I'm trying not to interrupt, but these are all very good points. Honestly, I kind of support that idea. And maybe if the council were considering my language, let's say even the first clause, one thing we could say is subject to final action of the Landmarks Commission, and therefore it will be clear if they've merely accepted a petition or taken some informal action or provisional action, that doesn't count. But if they've gotten all the way to the end point and they've said, this is not a landmark, then this sentence would be triggered. I think that's a fair comment.
And where would you put in the final action right before the petition? Go
So,
ahead.
sorry, Lynn, I don't mean to ascribe this to you, but I just thought it was a good comment you had. If we were considering the first sentence, but maybe just the first part, it would say section 1 shall not apply to any property which, prior to the effective date of this act, was the subject of final action by the Landmarks Commission on a landmarking petition, period.
Lynn, what are your thoughts about that?
I feel like I need to spend a little more time digesting this.
Uh-huh.
It does seem reasonable at first blush. Yes, I mean, landmarking can take more than 20 years from the submission of the petition to the actual vote to landmark. So that does make this more clear and more predictable. Yes, I guess.
All right, and for Allison's, to Allison's original request, I'm gonna go ahead and read the language out loud. For those people, again, who are watching it from at home, they don't have this document in front of them. So the original language is proposed, nothing, notwithstanding any other law, rule, regulation, or provision to the contrary, these sections shall apply to the Boston Landmarks Commission only, period. The amended language going on is as follows. However, Section 1 shall not apply to any property which, prior to the effective date of this act, was the subject of action by the Landmarks Commission on a landmarking petition or under Article 85 of the Boston Zoning Code relating to demolition delay. Further, no action of the Landmarks Commission under Section 1 shall be inconsistent with or invalidate any actions taken prior to the effective date of this act by the Zoning Board of Appeal, Boston Redevelopment Authority, or Inspectional Services Department of the City of Boston. Okay, so as I had mentioned, we're going to go back through counselors for any questions and suggestions. We'll start again with the lead sponsor, and then we'll go to Councilor Flaherty, Councilor Baker, Councilor Selby George, myself.
No further questions here, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councilor Bach?
Yeah, thank you. I was trying to send something back, and I feel like I'm close. But I guess my comments. So I mean, I think Allison's point about final action is important one. I think I totally agree with. I think we all link Article 85 in our minds here in terms of like the two tools, but this is really only speaking to the landmarking tool. And I agree that sort of, as Roseanne referenced, I think we all have lots of open questions. And I think probably, you know, people in the real estate board and on the Preservation Alliance have different views about how our whole regulatory apparatus between landmarks and ISD and the BPDA and all like operates and should operate. But ambitious as I am on many occasions, I am not aiming to take that on in this petition. So in this petition, I want to avoid getting entangled in that set of questions. I think that in terms of, I'm trying to think about a way to narrow this sentence, this sort of first phrase, to maybe be something like, you know, so if we have that first phrase, right, the kind of, I'm trying to pull it up here. However, section 1 shall not apply to any property which prior to the effective date of this act was the subject of final action by the Landmarks Commission on a landmarking petition. So two thoughts of mine. One is to say like within the last 10 years or something, because I just think that from an agency administrative perspective, it's useful to kind of have like a total set of landmarks petitions that you knew were like might fall into this category. Like if you're trying to keep track of who the exception applies to, and I don't think you want it to be some sort of open-ended like list all the way back to the history of the founding of the commission. And then the second thing would be to kind of add, and this I had a question for Adam about, you know, so sort of it said was subject to final action by the Landmarks Commission on a landmarking petition within the last 10 years, and is actively in the BRA's Article 80 process at the time of enactment, or is actively, like you made the reference to the fact that there are a bunch of places in the zoning code where we've put in this transition. I was wondering what that description is that gets used in other places of like a project that's sort of in process, because I think that's what we're trying to get at. And I think that piece is important, because what I'm super sympathetic to is what you're raising, like, you know, somebody who has gone a while down the development process here, has kind of baked in assumptions about their, you know, their like risks and sort of the financial picture for the project, and is worried about this upsetting the apple cart. Like, I totally get that concern. If I and my neighbors tried 7 years ago to landmark I'm just trying to come up with, you know, the corner store that's a super famous building, right? Like that in our neighborhood down the street. And Roseanne had to reject us because we didn't meet the state significance standard. And then this change happens and we say, hey, we would love to bring it back. And there's no active development going on with that building. Like, it seems to me like the language as currently drafted would rule those folks out. And that seems like it would be penalizing them for having been kind of on the ball before. So I'm curious if you could speak to like anywhere that a kind of a legal description of the type of project you're thinking of is used elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, all really good, helpful comments. Can I respond to both of those points, Councillor? So on the first one, I hear you about the time period. For what it's worth, if the council would consider this, I like the idea. I'd sort of love a longer time period if you'd consider that. I'm just thinking that I have projects, not a lot, admittedly, but there are projects that were stalled in the Great Recession, and they're keeping their permits alive. They're unquestionably projects like that. Yearly, they're keeping their permits alive, and they're getting additional permits, and they're hoping to start construction once the pandemic ends, which would put it more like, 15 years to 20 years. So just something to think about. But I hear your point that we don't want to be looking back 50 or 60 years for an issue like this. And then your second point is an excellent one. Again, the drafting here is challenging because I was trying to keep this pretty short and simple. Oftentimes, transition language says you must have submitted your application for zoning relief, for example, and you must actually get your zoning relief. And you must ultimately construct your project consistent with your zoning relief. And that's to prevent people taking advantage of this language and basically throwing something in the pipeline, which they know is going to get rejected. And then they have an argument that they have the benefit of this transition language. That's not the intent. And I think there could be a way to address that exactly as you're saying. I think we'd have to tinker with the language, but exactly as you're saying, maybe it's some concept that the project in question or the property in question is still actively being pursued and still has the benefit of, permits and approvals. That seems reasonable to me.
Is there anywhere you can think of where there's just literally an example of that language? I know we're sort of doing this all in real time, but.
Yeah, I think honestly of those 47 sections of the zoning code, I might even be able to find one while others are talking, but I think there is often concepts that you must continue your permitting and actually get the permits and the relief that you've requested. And you must ultimately construct the project, which is the subject to those permits. So again, there is that concept exactly as Councillor Bach was saying, that you sort of have to be actively working on this on a project to have the benefit of the transition language.
Yeah, because I think for me, something that said, however, Section 1 shall not apply to any property which prior to the effective date of this act was the subject of final action by the Landmarks Commission on a landmarking petition within the past 10 years. I hear you, maybe 15, 20 seems crazy to me. And then fill in like the set of stipulations that describe the project that we're talking about, right?
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair.
That seems like something we could work with.
Yep. It's a good thought.
Councillor Baker?
Just a brief comment. It's kind of a lot to follow here. We're going back 20 years, 15 years. I'm not really sure where I am on those projects. My concern would be more of the person that's in whatever process they're doing right now, and then this new legislation come out and then just get added on top of a process of somebody that's in the middle of it right now. I think what Adam is talking about, those older projects that already have their that already have their permits, those should go forward. I think with whatever it is they're doing. The old things. Like I said, my concern would be someone that's in the process right now. This passes, and then the neighborhood group that's on the ball says, "Whoa, wait a second there. Someone made something in that house there back in the 20s, and then it's a whole new." That person that's probably a small developer gets pushed back to, like, right at the beginning. That would be a concern. Does it happen? Does this legislation protect that, or does the new home rule, would we be open to a lot of that? I don't really know, but I just want to voice that one concern, and sort of a rhetorical question also. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Sabi George with us still? Just some initial thoughts. This is why we get right into the language of it at this moment, because a lot of this would have had to been done by the lead sponsor essentially on our own with me. And this is why the back and forth is so I think very valuable. I think we've come to some balancing points where there is an understanding that we don't want to hinder people who have gone through the process and make them wait longer or to a higher standard that they didn't predict. We also, and I don't know, I didn't hear your thoughts on the second part, that second sentence, which I'm very not comfortable with, Adam, involving I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that, but I think most of our language and most of our thoughts are in the first sentence, where there seems to be an agreement, there needs to be a balanced approach. So just curious what your thoughts about. I'm not, unless is there a push, to make me more comfortable with that second sentence?
Yeah, Councillor, again, good comment and helpful. Sort of yes, I'm being a little facetious. I mean, I love the second sentence, but I also obviously love the collaboration with the council and the historic preservation community. And it does seem to me that the first sentence is more on point. The second one, though, is very consistent with what Councillor Baker was saying, which is, let's say a project has simply not been reviewed by BLC because it didn't have significance at the local level. But let's say it spent 5 years going through a zoning process and an Article 80 process or a PDA process or an IMP process and spent millions of dollars and years of people's time. And literally at the last hour or day or month, this new law is passed, and suddenly the building in question does have local significance, and a petition is filed, and all that work is gone. Literally, that would prevent this project, which is played by the rules, which has gotten all of its permits, which is operating in accordance with existing law. It's all gone because a new law has subjected it to a different new risk. And that is, I think, a big concern by the real estate in the development community. Now, again, I'll say again, it's hard to draft this. I get it that my language is pretty short and simple. Again, the zoning code does this more methodically, and it says if you have a permit application in, and it's before the first notice of a public hearing of a new law, and you proceed through to get the permit in question, and you actually construct the project, then you have the benefit of this transition language. And that's to put in all the protections that we're talking about. And we could do that, but I think it was Councillor Bach who said, and I totally sympathize, it's hard to have a beautiful one-sentence legislation and tack 2 pages of legalese onto that. So I was trying to come up with a short form that I thought got to the same point, which is you can't invalidate the permits that are granted by major city agencies for a project that is played by the rules, played fairly, and just got caught up in a new law at the very end.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to essentially, I think I wouldn't say we're at loggerheads. I think we actually agree with the same goals. It is a question of how this language, which I do think there will be some changes, right, as proposed. But a lot of that will be based on the lead sponsor, which I know Kenzie, or Councillor Bach, excuse me, is working, as she stated, on that kind of sweet spot language. So I'm going to unless anyone has any additional thoughts about language, and by the way, Adam, Greg, Lynn, Rosemary, we accept testimony, and to Allison, we accept testimony and thoughts on language far beyond this working session. You would just need to submit it to our boston.gov emails to make sure it's part of the open meeting conversation and in part of this, with the headline of this ordinance, home rule petition in there. So we all keep it in the conversation within. So, but I do appreciate all of you for coming in, and I appreciate all of you getting to work in this working session. Thank you, Greg Vassal and Greater Boston Real Estate Board for coming in on this with some good suggestions. So I'm going to go back through. I guess I'm going to go ahead and allow Councillor Bach if you have any concluding remarks or any updates, and then I think for the most part we'll end with you.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. I was just going to ask Adam if you wanted to send along even what you were just referring to, the kind of language about the sort of, you know, something that's in the mix prior to the new law. That might just be helpful for thinking about even this category of like who you know, who sort of gets exempted. I do think there's a way for us to solve this problem sufficiently for projects currently in the pipeline, kind of based off of that first sentence without going to the second sentence. And I think one of the issues that Roseanne was raising is that as much as it may feel this way to the development community right now, like the Landmarks Commission never invalidates the processes of these other boards. It's just like its own parallel process that has to do with historic preservation. And I understand, this is my reference, like I understand that the development community is frustrated by the place that Article 85 comes in often in the process, and that like last minute landmarking efforts come. And frankly, the funny thing is that, you know, having both Gregs on the phone here, right? Like the funny thing is that the historic preservation community is also frustrated by that placement in the process. And so I do think there is like a broader policy conversation about how we solve this in a way that is better for kind of the historic preservation of the city and also for predictability in the development sphere. Like that's a real problem that we have. It's just that is something that I think we all need to like talk about and figure out, and like, and probably involves like sort of shifting how the order of operations of some of our processes. And like I said, I do have ambitions to help us solve that problem because I hear about it all the time, but I don't with this act. So I hear what you're saying about that fear of like, oh, it's all gonna get unraveled at the end of the process. But what I hear in that is more an overall concern about the way that Article 85 and landmarking kind of like functions in our space right now. And I think we need to solve that together as a separate policy conversation, if that makes sense. But I do think that but what you mentioned about kind of, I just want what I'm going to have my staff do, and what I would invite others who are watching to do as we work on this in conjunction with the chair would just be any place where there's a description of that sort of captures the type of project that we're worried about, that we've used elsewhere in the city code or in parallel. I think that would be helpful for us to sort of solve for this right now. So it'd be great to send it over. And otherwise, I really appreciate, it's a real brain trust on the phone today on this front. And I appreciate everybody making the time at short notice to do this with us, and grateful as ever for the chair and her thoughtfulness. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. So with that, assuming there's a good back and forth and we can strike that balance, I'd like to bring it before my colleagues. Again, knowing timing is also everything at the State House as well. And making sure that we can strike that balance together and get, I think, appropriate legislation up there. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude this working session. It doesn't stop the conversation. Again, people can submit language suggestions, corrections, concerns, and questions throughout. With that, thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you, Councilor.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.